What was the new imperialism? The new imperialism was the rapid expansion of European powers, and later on countries such as Japan, to conquer as much of the world as possible. Okay, so why was the new imperialism? The new imperialism was motivated by economic factors. Europeans had developed, or some European countries had developed, large industrial bases, such as the United Kingdom, where the Industrial Revolution began, and followed by France and Germany. These largely developed countries were able to produce goods, and in exchange, they wanted raw materials in order to fuel their factories. These raw materials pushed Europeans to expand into countries like the Congo and Central Africa, where one could get large quantities of rubber. In addition, they wanted markets where they could sell the materials that they produced. Additionally, they were motivated by political factors. These political factors include being embarrassed by other countries, such as France accelerating its expansion after facing the embarrassment of the Franco-Prussian War, and by general popular support, where people were demanding that, say, Germany establish colonies, and the government eventually ended up relenting. So, why were people so supportive of the new imperialism? Part of it is, well, it was motivated by ideology. Part of it includes racism, which you can imagine. We've discussed phrenology and social Darwinism as ways in which Europeans justified their belief that they were superior to the people they were conquering. Additionally, there was Christianity. Europeans justified their actions by claiming that they were converting the local population to Christianity. In addition, they claimed humanitarian goals, such as ending the slave trade. Was any of this really true? As you'd probably expect, not really. But imperialism was sort of like an evil fashion trend of the 1880s and 1890s. The colonizers ended up conquering a ton of land, and despite being exceptionally brutal, they didn't end up making much of a profit off of it, or at least it's disputed whether or not they made a profit off of it. In addition, people did convert to Christianity in Africa, this was not something that happened during the first 20 years or the first generation of imperialism. And also, the Europeans leaving Africa in the 20th century did not slow down the process. So the missionaries seemingly could have operated completely independently. And when it comes to the humanitarian goals, um, the slave trade was partially stopped by Europeans, but in exchange, they subjected the locals to extreme brutality, such as cutting off hands in the Congo for people who did not produce enough rubber. So, the new imperialism was broadly a failure. So, how did the Europeans conquer an entire continent which did not want to be conquered? One of the things that proved a major advantage was the invention of new technologies. These technologies include the steamship, which could go up and down rivers, as well as move between continents much faster than traditional sailboats. Additionally, there are the telegraphs. Telegraphs allow for rapid, or relatively rapid by 19th century standards, communication between large distances, which allowed colonies to communicate with their mother country, and vice versa. Additionally, there are breech loading rifles. Breech loading rifles are useful because they can be loaded much quicker than muzzle loading rifles and muzzle loading muskets. Additionally, there's quinine. Quinine is very useful for treating malaria, which is one of the leading causes of death amongst the early European colonizers of Africa. Um, and finally, there is the Maxim gun, an early machine gun, which proved to be very effective, particularly against the often poorly equipped local soldiers that the Europeans were facing. The new imperialism would really reach its fever pitch with the scramble for Africa in the 1880s. If we go back to the 1850s, what we'll see is that Europeans only really control small coastal colonies, which they use for trading with the local populations. The only real exception for this would be the formerly Dutch colony of South Africa, which they handed over to the British for protection during the Napoleonic Wars. The Dutch, however, were distracted by Napoleon, thanks Napoleon, and they forgot to keep track of their receipts. And as they did not read the fine print and realized that this would void their colony return, when they asked for South Africa back, the British decided not to return it. Always be very careful to read the fine print before handing a country over to the British Empire. In the 1870s, we'd start to see a growth in European interest in Africa because missionaries and explorers such as David Livingstone were going around and writing about it. One of the things that really built interest was David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, disappearing, and Europeans and Americans putting together an expedition to try to find and rescue him. Um, this excitement, as well as the discovery of some of the economic uses of expansion and the political uses of expansion, meant that in the 1880s, Europeans would start conquering Africa as quickly as they could. The main cause of the scramble for Africa was the desire to control African resources and to build a sense of national pride. For instance, for the French, their colonialism was often inspired by either recovering lost honor from a war, such as being embarrassed by the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, or even earlier, their conquest of Algeria was heavily inspired by the King of France trying to distract people from being mad at him for being the King of France as opposed to the President of France. Um, so, the discovery of rubber in Africa proved to be a game changer for colonization. Before this, the valuable resources that people were chasing after in Africa were things like ivory, diamonds, and gold, which were pretty, and with ivory had some uses, such as piano keys, but were also largely decorative items that people could live without. However, with rubber and palm oil, there proved to be serious industrial uses that meant that the more you could get, the better you could industrialize. So this helped cause the economic inspiration for the scramble for Africa. There was also belief. There was also a belief called ethnocentrism, where countries would believe that they had the best culture in the world, and their culture was better than all the other cultures in the world. So if they were to conquer people and force them to accept their cultures, they would argue that they were just helping those people because they get to be more like the French. Um, so in addition to this, there was nationalism, which is the belief that a single country should be the most powerful country on the planet, and all other countries should either be subject to them or just destroyed, which we will see that ideology grow in terrifying ways later. Um, this nationalistic competition meant that a lot of times European countries would conquer land without really wanting the land, just wanting to prevent another country from having it. A good example of this would be Britain encouraging France to conquer the country of Tunisia, because Britain did not want Italy to get Tunisia, because if Italy controlled Tunisia, then they would control the entire middle of the Mediterranean Sea, which could prove difficult for England or Britain if Britain and Italy ever ended up at war. We'll see if this ever proves to be an important factor. Um, the only countries that remained independent were Ethiopia and Liberia. Ethiopia would actually fight off attempted invasions from both Egypt and France, while the Europeans were competing with each other to conquer and subjugate as many millions of people as possible in the shortest possible time. They started to get concerned that one of their conflicts would end up breaking out into a conflict between two European powers and cause a major war that they actually stood a chance of losing. So in order to help prevent this, they decided that they should hold a meeting in Berlin to prevent Europeans from fighting each other while they were trying to conquer a continent. So Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Germany, and Italy all had land interests in Africa. They all had things that they wanted to conquer and control. And then other countries, such as Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the United States, did not want any land from Africa. However, they still wanted a say in how things were going to be run in those colonies. For instance, the United States wanted any country that was conquered to have a free, open market. That way, the US would be allowed to purchase the goods that they produced. Promising an open market is part of how King Leopold, always there, was able to convince the Americans to become the first country to recognize the Congo Free State, which was really King Leopold's personal colony in the Congo, which would end up being taken over by Belgium later due to the extreme brutality of King Leopold. Um, though these colonies were not opened up for free trade, it was often promised that they would be, and that was the goal of the Americans in the conference. Um, so the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck led this conference in order to decide how they would resolve disputes between colonial powers and basically determine who was going to get what in Africa. He invited everyone who he and the other European leaders thought had an opinion that mattered. It probably should not surprise us that not a single African leader or representative was included on this list. Um, the Berlin Conference would help lead to the borders of Africa that exist even today, and it did not show any regard for things like culture, ethnicity, language, or religion of the people they were conquering. This is partly because the Europeans wanted to divide and conquer. A lot of times, soldiers would be taken, or soldiers would be recruited, often by force, from one part of Africa and sent to another in order to enforce colonial law. But since these soldiers were in a completely different culture a completely different culture than the one that they came from, and they spoke different languages and often had different religions, the soldiers would not have any more in common with the local Africans they were helping to oppress than they did with the British or the French or the Belgians they were working with. Um, so for this disregard for the cultures, religions, and languages of Africa is still seen and is still a source of conflict in African countries today.